Have you ever wondered what you would be able to do if everything you loved were torn from you in a world where your existence was worthless than a tool? The stories that never told us reveal more about our past than we can imagine. And today, I will share with you a truth that has been buried for centuries in Louisiana's cotton plantations. While researched old documents in the Baton Rouge archives, I came across records that mentioned a mysterious fire during the 1832 Mardi Gras. The authorities tried to put out not only the flames, but the memory of the man who controlled them. Peter, a slave whose ability with fire became a symbol of a resistance that no one expected. What you are about to find out is not in school books. It is a history of pain, planning, and revenge that shuttered the foundations of the American slave system. A story that reveals as a single man, determined to do justice, managed to shake the cotton empire in a single night. If you appreciate historical narratives that challenge what we know about our past, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any of these resistance stories that remain hidden. This is just one of so many silenced voices that deserve to be heard. Get ready to meet Peter, the man who turned the 1832 Mardi Gras festivities into a fire court against the cruelty of 9 of the most powerful Baton Rouge cotton barons. Only charred wreckage remains of the Whitfield mansion in the eastern region of Baton Rouge. Among the blackened ruins, the smell of burnt wood still seems to impregnate the moist air of Louisiana, even after almost 2 centuries. Visitors report a strange heat that persists even on colder days, as if the fire that consumed those walls still burned in some parallel dimension. On full moon nights, they say it is possible to hear the crepitate of non-existent flames. It was in this place that 9 of the most influential Louisiana cotton barons gathered for a celebration of Mardi Gras in February 1832, ignoring that their actions had lit a much more dangerous fire in a man's heart. Peter's story is not just about revenge, it is about the inescapable law of consequence, how each act of cruelty eventually finds its account adjustment. Local inhabitants avoid the ruins of the Whitfield mansion. On the partially preserved walls, black marks rise as charred fingers pointing to the sky, a silent testimony that seems to say, no injustice remains forever unpunished. Those flames revealed an uncomfortable truth, that the supposed order and civilization of the South Slavocrat was sustained by boundless violence against human beings reduced to the condition of property. In the ashes of that fire, a symbol was born. A symbol that the most absolute power can be challenged, that the fire of freedom can hide in the most unlikely embers, expecting only the right breath to become a purifying hell. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Whitfield Plantation extended for over 4,000 acres of fertile land on the banks of the Mississippi River. Its borders were demarcated by flawless white wood fences, while dozens of centenary oaks formed an imposing avenue that led to the large house, a 3-story Georgian structure with 24 Greek columns supporting a balcony surrounding the entire building. To the south, more than 40 cabins of 5 row trunks housed the 178 slaves that kept the plantation working. At the top of the hierarchy was Joseph Whitfield, a man whose name caused as much respect as a terror throughout the parish of East Baton Rouge. Below it, a precise structure of power, the white capataz Conrad Steiner, known for its 9-pointed whip adorned with metal fragments, the black overseers, chosen for their loyalty and brutality, and the field forever, responsible for extracting every drop of sweat and blood needed to turn cotton into white gold. For slaves, the day began long before sunrise. The plantation bell, a bronze object brought from England that produced a penetrating sound capable of waking up to the dead, sounded at 4:30 in the morning. Men, women, and children over 7 were exactly 15 minutes to be in formation in the central yard. With the exception of the elderly and terminal sick, they all worked in the cotton fields until the sun was put, often under a 40-degree heat that turned the air into a wet furnace. The control system was relentless. Each slave received a daily cotton quota for spoon, 200 pounds during the main harvest, impossible for many. Each pound ABA under the quota meant a whip blow. In the center of the yard, a wooden trunk with iron rings remained a constant memory of the price of disobedience. Beside a sun-exposed metal cage served to discipline the most rebellious, which were there for days without enough water. The big house, with its glass windows imported from France, watched everything. Of the spacious balconies, the Whitfield and his guests often attended punishments as a form of entertainment, bending expensive liqueurs in crystal bowls. The sound of the whip tearing human flesh often mixed by tilting these glasses in gifts with prosperity. At night, the heavy air carried the sweet smell of cotton fields mixed with the metal odor of the blood, while in the senzalas the whispers of ancestral stories and forbidden songs tried to heal wounds that no medicine could treat. And it was in these whispers that slowly began to circulate a name pronounced with reverence: Peter, the man who knew the secrets of fire. Among the slaves of Plantation Whitfield, Peter occupied a unique position. At 28, his black skin as coal contrasted with eyes of a brown so clear that they seemed almost golden in the sunlight. Eyes that observed everything, which absorbed details, who calculated possibilities. Born in the plantation itself, Peter had learned early Ferraria's art from old Tobias, an African of Dahomey who had brought with him the ancestral secrets of metalwork. Peter's hands, with long and heated fingers, dominated the fire like no one else. Under its supervision, the iron folded and transformed. This ability had made him too valuable for cotton fields. As a plantation blacksmith, Peter created and fixed tools, horseshoes, hinges, and even the metal ornaments that decorated the Whitfield mansion. His forge, located 200 meters from Casa Grande, was his dominion, a small territory where fire obeyed his will. But Peter's true talent was beyond the forge. He had a prodigious memory and an intelligence that needed to hide carefully. At the rare occasions when he was called to the big house to install some metal piece, his golden eyes recorded every detail: the location of the doors and windows, the habits of the residents, the entrance and exit routes, the place where the keys were stored. And no one suspected that behind that submissive stance and those low eyes hid a mind that methodically mapped the heart of power that imprisoned him. The blacksmith was moving between two worlds. In the senzala, he was respected for his knowledge, by the strength of his arms capable of bending the metal, and the wisdom with which he advised the younger ones. At Casa Grande, it was just a useful tool, invisible as a person, noticed only for the quality of his work. This invisibility has become its greatest weapon, because who suspects the shadow that goes unnoticed? The African stories that the old Tobias had told him spoke of Ogum, the Oryxa of iron and fire, the one who opens ways, and gradually Peter had understood that his knowledge gave him a power that his masters would never imagine. He knew that fire was not just destruction, it was transformation, purification, rebirth. He knew how to create it, control him, direct him. And more importantly, I knew how to wait for the right moment. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. Plantation Whitfield was not just a place of forced labor. It was a systematic theater of calculated horrors. In January 1830, when Mary, a 14-year-old slave, dropped a porcelain tray, Joseph Whitfield ordered her fingers to be crushed with a hammer one by one, while dinner guests watched the lesson. 2 weeks later, when John, a field slave, did not reach his quota, was tied to a tree and whipped until his back became an unrecognizable mass of exposed flesh. It survived only 3 days. In the summer of that same year, 3 slaves tried to escape. They were hunted with dogs, recaptured, and brought back. The punishment, amputation of each other's left foot, performed by the Whitfield family doctor as a scientific demonstration to other slave owners in the region. Peter was forced to raise irons to cauterize injuries, their first creations designed to cause deliberate pain. Each witnessed atrocity transformed something within Peter. Each whip coup he heard, every scream that reverberated through the fields, every humiliation imposed on his brothers and sisters, everything accumulated as iron being heated in the forge, becoming more malleable, more prone to transformation. In February 1831, when the foreman Conrad Steiner raped Sarah, a 16-year-old, in front of his father, wakes up raised, Peter felt the first genuine impulse of rebellion. That night, alone in his small cabin attached to the forge, allowed himself to cry for the first time since childhood. Silent tears that fell like cast metal, cauterizing any remnants of submission in his soul. His hands, so skilled in shaping iron, closed on fists that promised a different kind of creation, the forge of a new destination. In September, when he observed Joseph Whitfield punishing two young children, tying them together and hanging them upside down in a dry well for stealing a loaf of bread, something was definitely broken inside him. His eyes, always attentive but cautious, now contained an inflexible resolution. The other slaves noticed the change, as if an inner flame had been lit, constantly burning behind those golden eyes. At night, when the wind blew in the right direction, taking the sounds away from the big house, Peter began to share stories of rebellion in other parts, some rees, some invented, all inspiring. Stories about slaves who had faced their oppressors, who had chosen death in combat rather than life in chains. And as he spoke, he watched the faces around him, looking for those who, like him, kept the fire of rebellion under the mask of submission. Peter's inner change remained invisible to the Whitfield. He continued his work with the same meticulous accuracy, kept his eyes low in the presence of the masters, performed orders without apparent questioning, but inside, every witnessed atrocity was carefully catalogued. Every shared pain fed the furnace of its determination. The blacksmith, who knew the secret of turning gross ore into tools, was slowly turning his own pain into a weapon, waiting for the moment to be wielded. That Tuesday of August 1831 started like any other. The bell sounded before dawn. The slaves formed queues in the yard for counting. The work in the fields began under the first orange shine of the rising sun. Peter lit his forge and began repairing broken tools during the day's harvest. Louisiana's intense summer warmth caused the air around the forge to wave, creating the illusion that reality itself distorts itself. That was when the scream tore the air, a sound so loaded with agony that it seemed momentarily silence all the other noises of the plantation. Peter left the forge, his eyes immediately locating the origin, the small cabin where his mother, Hannah, lived since she had been blinded due to strenuous work in the cotton fields. At 58, Hannah survived making small straw baskets that were sold in the Baton Rouge market. Peter's heart froze when he saw Conrad Steiner coming out of the cabin, tidying his pants, a satisfied smile on his face. The foreman passed him, patting him on his shoulder like old friends. "Your mother should thank you for your attention. Isn't it every day that an old blind man gets a visit, isn't it, a blacksmith?" Peter entered the cabin and found his mother lying on the dirt floor, her only torn dress, blood running down her legs. His hands gripped the air, looking for something to cover himself. "Peter, is it you, my son?" His voice trembled. "Don't let anyone see me like this." With a delicacy that contrasted with the growing fury on his chest, Peter covered his mother with a blanket spent, cleaned his face with water from a small jar, and held his wrinkled hands. The same hands that had packed him, who had worked to bleed to keep him alive, who had transmitted through touch the love they could not express freely. "It will pass, Mom. He will pass," murmured, the words coming out like embers between his teeth. Hannah squeezed her hand with a surprising force. "Don't do anything, my son. They will kill you. Promise me." But Peter couldn't make such a promise. That night Hannah developed fever. His body, already weakened by decades of forced labor and deprivation, was unable to combat the infection resulting from the violence suffered. Peter remained by his side, applying humid compresses on his forehead, murmuring the old songs she used to sing to him in childhood. At dawn on the third day, Hannah called her son close. His blind eyes seemed to be fixed in something beyond the material world. "Peter," whispered, "remember what old Tobias said about fire? That he purifies, that he transforms, that he frees." His words were interrupted by a violent cough. "Rest, Mom," Peter begged, holding his handsome hands. "Promise me one thing," Hannah continued, her voice now just a breath. "Promise you'll live. You'll find a way to freedom." "I promise," said Peter, knowing that that promise contained a lot more than simple words could express. Hannah smiled slightly. "I see fire, my son, a fire that cleans this place. It's beautiful." It was your last words. At dawn, Peter washed her mother's body with rainwater she had collected, put her with the best dress she had, a faded blue fabric kept for special occasions that never came. On his fingers, he put a small iron ring that had secretly forged for her years earlier, a single piece of metal that formed a perfect circle, symbolizing the love that no slavery could break. During the brief funeral allowed, Peter kept his face impassive, his eyes low, the submissive posture expected of him. But when the first shovel of earth fell over the body wrapped in simple fabric, something solidified inside it, not as an incandescent iron that could be shaped, but as seasoned, inflexible, and sharply as a newly bordered blade. The Whitfield plantation was not only governed by Joseph Whitfield. A constellation of cruelty was formed, 9 men who shared not only economic interests, but a philosophy based on the absolute dehumanization of the slaves they had. They fit themselves the guardians, a closed circle of slave owners who controlled virtually the entire Baton Rouge economy and neighboring regions. Thomas Reynolds, with his cold blue eyes such as ice, had specialized in the strategic separation of slave families, selling children, wives and husbands separately to maximize profits and break any sense of community or resistance. His favorite method of punishment was controlled drowning, plunging slaves into water barrels to almost death repeatedly. William Barrett, an almost clerical-looking man with round glasses and meek speech, was known for his educational system, whipping slaves as he recited carefully selected biblical passages to justify slavery. He often lent young slaves to important visitors as a way to consolidate political and commercial alliances. The Fontaine brothers, Edmund and Richard, had transformed psychological torture into science. In their plantation, they kept a correction room where slaves were forced to a stripping to each other, destroying bonds of trust and friendship. They suggested to Joseph Whitfield the strategy of forcing Peter to forge the instruments used to punish their own companions. James Hamilton, a trained doctor in Edinburgh, performed medical experiments in sick or injured slaves, testing theories about different thresholds of pain between races. His notebook, discovered decades later, would reveal meticulous observations on how long different individuals could survive with certain injuries or deprivation. Samuel Montgomery, the youngest in the group, compensated for his inexperience with innovative cruelty. It was his idea of the Sunday races, where exhausted slaves after 6 days of work were forced to compete in brutal races, with the losers receiving public whipping. George Anderson, the group's politician, guaranteed that local laws continue to favor their interests. As a parish judge, he assured that no accusation of cruel treatment for slaves to never thrive in the courts of Baton Rouge. Frederick Parker, merchant and owner of ships, administered cotton transport and slave imports, many of them illegally smuggled after the ban on international trafficking. His network of contacts extended to New Orleans, ensuring that any fugitive slave was quickly recaptured. In February 1832, a 10th element was added to this power structure. Charles Livingston, a young English aristocrat newly bursted to Louisiana with plans to establish his own plantation, was invited to the Guardian Circle. Its initiation should take place during the Mardi Gras festivities, a private celebration at the Whitfield mansion, where it would be presented to the group's owner methods to maximize slave productivity. It was the announcement of this celebration that served as the final catalyst for Peter. Symbolism could not be clearer. While you celebrated with masks, fantasies, music, and banquets, less than 200 meters, the slaves who made it all possible defined in unhealthy huts, many of them carrying still open wounds from recent punishments. That night, in the small hut attached to the forge where he lived alone since his mother's death, Peter made his decision. Hannah's final words echoed in his mind. "I see fire, my son. A fire that cleans this place." He then understood that the fire that dominated so well in his forge had a greater purpose. It would be an instrument not only of creation, but justice. Humanization came on the first Monday of February, exactly a week before Mardi Gras. The day dawned with a thick fog covering the fields of the Whitfield plantation, a rare phenomenon at that time of year, as if nature itself was trying to hide what was about to happen. Peter worked in his forge since dawn, creating a series of metal ornaments commissioned by Joseph Whitfield to decorate the main hall of the mansion during the Mardi Gras party. Intrincated flower-leaf symbols and carnival masks took shape under their skillful hands, each piece an example of its mastery over the metal. Irony did not escape him. He was creating beauty to adorn the celebration of the same men who had destroyed everything he loved. Conrad Steiner appeared at the forge door, accompanied by 2 female and Joseph Whitfield himself. The blacksmith immediately lowered his eyes, assuming the expected submissive posture. "The work is almost done, Master Whitfield," he said, keeping his voice neutral, devoid of any emotion that could be interpreted as insolence. "We did not come in the ornaments," replied Whitfield, his voice carrying that tone of false cordiality that always preceded some cruelty. "We received a very serious complaint against you, a blacksmith." Peter's heart accelerated. Would anyone discover their plans? Impossible. I had not yet shared your thoughts with anyone. "Sarah, the seamstress, says you tried to escape last night," continued Whitfield. "He says he saw him gathering provisions and testing the fence at the back of the property." Peter kept his face impassive, though internally he was perplexed. He had never done such a thing, and knew Sarah just from sight, a recently acquired young slave who worked at Casa Grande. Why would you invent such a story? "I didn't leave my cabin last night, Master," answered calmly. "I was working in the ornaments late." Whitfield smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's really, well, Sarah was quite convincing. And you know what is curious? She told me that right after Let's enjoy her company. It looks like the girl wanted to ensure a special treatment." At that moment, Peter understood. Sarah had been forced to invent an accusation against him, probably to divert the attention of some mistake she had made, or simply because Whitfield needed a pretext to punish someone and show power before the arrival of their illustrious guests. "Bring him to the yard," ordered Whitfield, turning to leave, "and all call it to watch. We need to remind these blacks what happens to those who think of running away." In the center of the main torero of the plantation, where all slaves were gathered for daily counting, the flagellation pole was raised a solidly filed oak trunk, with iron hoops fixed at different heights. Peter was taken there, his clothes torn to his waist. The muscles in his back and arms, developed for years of work in the forge, now exposed to the weak sun that was beginning to dispel the fog. The 178 plantation slaves were forced to form a circle around the pole. Among them, Peter saw known faces, people who respected him, who came to his forge in search of advice or just to hear the stories he kept alive. He also saw Sarah's face, pale and terrified, his eyes fixed to the ground, unable to face the man who had been unfairly accused by her. Whitfield positioned himself in a small stage alongside the other 8 guardians who had been invited to witness the punishment. The young English aristocrat, Charles Livingston, was also present, observing everything with clinical curiosity, such as who studies an agricultural administration technique. This slave, who received privileged treatment as a blacksmith, planned to escape, announced Whitfield aloud. "This demonstrates unacceptable ingratitude. Punishment will be exemplary, 50 whipping. And to make the lesson even more memorable, each of the guardians will apply 5 blows." Peter was tied to the post, arms straight above the head, the body forming a perfect target for the whip. The first to wield the punishment instrument was Conrad Steiner, the same man who had raped and caused the death of his mother. The forefront flexed the whip in the air a few times, smiling when he heard the silvo he produced. Then, with a fluid movement, he applied the first blow. The pain exploded on Peter's back, a fire line that seemed to cut his flesh to the bone. He rapped his teeth, determined not to emit a single sound. The second blow came shortly thereafter, crossing the first, pulling skin and meat. The third, the room. The fifth. Each blow was accompanied by a sepulchral silence of the forced audience. The only sound was the whistle whip cutting the air and the wet impact when it reached the already lacerated meat. After Steiner, it was the turn of Thomas Reynolds, who applied his 5 blows to the accuracy of those who practiced the act regularly. Then William Barrett, reciting biblical verses among the lashes. The Fontaine brothers, alternating and competing to see who drew the most blood. James Hamilton, the doctor, who deliberately aimed at still intact points of the skin. Samuel Montgomery, who laughed at every blow. George Anderson, who was discussing the legal need for discipline. Frederick Parker, who applied the lashes with the efficiency of those who dispatch a merchandise. Lastly, Joseph Whitfield resumed the whip, now stew with Peter's blood. The last 5 blows, announced, will be applied by our special guest to learn our administration techniques. Charles Livingston hesitated briefly before accepting the whip. His face revealed a mixture of discomfort and morbid fascination. With no experience, his first blow was clumsy, barely hitting Peter's already massacred back. The other guardians laughed, offering technical advice. "Firmness on the wrist, my dear. Use the entire arm, not just the forearm. Mire in the same place twice for greater effect." The following blows were more effective, tearing up new pieces of skin. When the 15th blow was finally applied, Peter's backs were no longer recognizable as part of a human being. The exposed raw meat with skin fragments hanging like bloody rags resembled. Throughout the punishment, Peter did not emit a single scream. His silence was more disturbing than any plea or moan would have been. When it was finally untied, his legs gave in and he fell to his knees. Still, he found the strength to lift his head and look straight into Joseph Whitfield's eyes, a look that lasted only 2 seconds, but contained all the fire that burned inside him. Whitfield, momentarily disconcerted by that unexpected demonstration of dignity, quickly recovered the composure. "Take it to the forge," he ordered. "Wide your wounds with salt and vinegar. He needs to be alive and working in 3 days. We have ornaments to finish before Mardi Gras." While Peter was dragged back to the forge, semi-conscious by pain and blood loss, something had irrevocably changed inside him. Public humiliation had not broken his spirit. He had eliminated the last ties of hesitation. The faces of the 9 guardians and the young English, their smiles, their glances of satisfaction in the face of human suffering. Everything was engraved in his memory with the accuracy of an ember iron marking leather. Lying face down on the dirt floor of his cabin, his back turned into a blood mass grew with the punitive mixture of salt and vinegar that intensified the pain instead of relieving it, Peter entered an altered state of consciousness. The fever that followed the flagellation brought visions, his mother smiling, the old Tobias teaching him to control the fire, and then flames that consumed the whole plantation, flames that danced around the bodies of the guardians. When he finally recovered his full conscience 3 days later, a supernatural calm had seized him. Pain persisted, intense and constant, but now it seemed to belong to someone else. Peter watched her with clinical detachment, as if her body were just a tool, not unlike the hammer or anvil she used in her craft. It was time to turn visions into concrete plans. Plantation Whitfield slaves knew that something had changed in Peter after public flagellation. His eyes, once carefully neutral in the presence of the masters, now contained a feverish glow even when they lowered their heads in apparent submission. Some avoided him, fearing that any association with him could attract similar punishments. Others, however, were inexplicably attracted to their presence, like moths toward the flame. It was with the latter that Peter began to share fragments of his plan, never revealing the totality to anyone, only the parts necessary for each individual. The selection was meticulous, needed specific people with specific skills, and above all, with an inner fire similar to yours. Isaiah, 42, had been a cook at Casa Grande for 2 decades. He knew every corner of the kitchen, every food habit of Whitfield and his frequent guests. More importantly, he had access to herbs and new combinations that could induce deep sleep without leaving noticeable traits in the taste of food. "I'm not asking you to poison anyone," Peter explained one night when both were alone near the little stream that ran at the back of the property. "Just add something to ensure that they will sleep deeply the celebration of Mardi Gras." Isaiah watched Peter at length, her eyes evaluating the blacksmith. "This will cost more than our lives to find out," he said finally. "You understand that, don't you?" "There is nothing more they can take from me," said Peter simply. "They already took everything." The cook nodded slowly. "I have a dust made of datura seeds. Mixed with wine, it will sleep like stones, without memory of the night before. I can put in the last bottle, the one that always open when they are already drunk." The second recruited was Solomon, an elderly man who worked at the stable. Over 60, it was practically invisible to you, just another curved shadow taking care of the horses. But Solomon knew every animal, every carriage, and most importantly, every possible escape route. "I need to discreetly sabotage the wheels of all the carriages on the night of the party," asked Peter. "Nothing obvious, just enough to break if someone tries to run away." Solomon didn't ask for the reason. He just nodded. His old eyes revealed that he had expected decades for a moment like that. Rachel, a 19-year-old girl who worked in the laundry, became the third ally. Her delicate and accurate hands could go unnoticed by collecting small amounts of oil from the lamp around the house, without anyone noting the gradual disappearance. "Every drop for 2 weeks," instructed Peter. "Bring me in the forge at dusk." Esther, who took care of the garden and knew each plant, every shrub around the mansion, was in charge of identifying the best access and escape points, the blind angles of the windows, the places where the shadows were more dense even in moonlight. Jacob, a strong young man who worked in the cotton warehouse, had the task of discreetly separating small amounts of the most flammable material, still unrued cotton, rich in natural oils that would catch fire with scary easily. For each one, Peter revealed only the necessary, never the full plan, never the ultimate goal. Some suspected, others preferred not to know, fearing that the full knowledge could make them hesitate when the time came. In the forge, while completing the metal ornaments for Mardi Gras, Peter worked simultaneously on other objects, small hollow metal spheres with a small hole, sealed ceramic bottles, glass containers protected by metal plots. Each piece created with accuracy, each part of a larger puzzle than only it could completely visualize. At night in his cabin, Peter designed detailed maps of Whitfield Mansion on the ground floor, erasing them at dawn. Memorized distances, angles, routes, times. He calculated how long the fire would take to spread from one room to another, how long the doors and windows would hold before giving in to the flames, how long the city firefighters would take to arrive, if they were called. He chose the date with astronomical accuracy, the night of Mardi Gras, when the 10 men would be gathered in the mansion, when the drink would flow freely, when attention would be geared towards the celebration. And there was a powerful symbolism in choosing Mardi Gras, the last night of excesses before the Lent penance period. Peter would guarantee that for the Guardians, the penance would be eternal. 3 days after the execution of the plan, he named his method Ogum's Judgment. In the mythology the old Tobias had taught him, Ogum was the Oryxa of iron and fire, the lord of the forge, the one who opened ways cutting obstacles with his sword. And Peter would be his earthly instrument, using the fire to make a path of justice through the Whitfield plantation. On the eve of Mardi Gras, an electric atmosphere permeated the entire plantation Whitfield. In Casa Grande, dozens of servants ran to finish the preparations of the great celebration. Persian rugs were extended in the halls, polished silver candlesticks until they reflect as thin mirrors, crystals and porcelain meticulously arranged on the long oak tables. The latest deliveries arrived from Baton Rouge, French champagne boxes, Scottish whiskey barrels, exotic baskets imported from the Caribbean. In the main room, Joseph Whitfield personally supervised the organization of his fantasy for the night, an elaborate dress of the Carnival King, with a gold-embroidered purple cloak, semi-compliant, stone-studded crown, and a solid silver scepter that Peter had forged especially for the occasion. The other Guardians would also have thematic fantasies, representing different figures of power: judge, general, bishop, senator. Meanwhile, on slave premises, a very different kind of preparation occurred. In his forge, Peter gave the last touches on small metal devices the size of a closed fist. Trabalhava with an absolute concentration, his hands moving with the accuracy of a surgeon. Each device was carefully filled with a mixture of gunpowder, metal fragments, and the oil that Rachel had collected over the weeks. Peter salated each one with beeswax, inserting a small wick made of cotton soaked in a substance he had prepared himself, a combination of vegetable resins that would guarantee a slow and constant combustion. Beside it, in a small table, were arranged glass vials containing flammable liquids, oil combinations, distilled alcohol that Isaiah had diverted from the kitchen, and pine sap collected by Esther. Small cotton packages separated by Jacob were organized into a fire-resistant leather bag, another product of Peter's ability with materials. The blacksmith had calculated every detail, where each device would be positioned, how long it would take to move from one point to another of the mansion, how many seconds each wick would need to ensure that everyone entered combustion at the same time. The sun was beginning to put when Peter finished its preparations. Outside the forge, he could hear the song that was beginning to play in the big house, a string quartet hired especially for the occasion. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to visualize each step of the plane once again. Then, with deliberate movements, he kept all devices and materials in a specially designed bag that could be carried under his clothes without being noticed. At Casa Grande, the celebration began officially. Carriages arrived on the main road of Plantation, bringing the guardians and their wives, all in elaborate carnival fantasies. Thomas Reynolds as an Inquisition judge, with black cloak and red hood. William Barrett dressed as a Catholic cardinal, in purple and scarlet. The Fontaine brothers fantasized with Napoleonic generals, with uniforms loaded with false medals. James Hamilton as a medieval doctor with black plague mask. Samuel Montgomery as an Ottoman sultan in silks and turban. George Anderson as a Roman senator with toga and loros. Frederick Parker as a ship captain, complete with tricorn hat and golden scope. The special guest, Charles Livingston, arrived last, dressed as a 18th century French aristocrat. A blocked wig, blue silk jacket, tight shorts, and silver buckle shoes. His face was partially covered by a Venetian mask that showed only his thin lips and a pointed chin. The wives and daughters of the guardians sported sumptuous dresses, stunning jewelry, and elaborate masks decorated with plumes and colored stones. The song became higher when everyone gathered in the main hall, where slaves were servicing champagne bowls and silver trays. Joseph Whitfield, in his Carnival King costume, rose in a small makeshift to welcome. "My dear guardians, His Majestic consorts, our estimated guest of England," proclaimed aloud, lifting his cup. "Welcome to our private Mardi. Tonight, we celebrate not only the carnival spirit, but our prosperous brotherhood, which has kept order and prosperity in our region." Enthusiastic applause followed his words. Whitfield made a wide gesture, indicating the tables loaded with delicacies. "May the party start, may wine flow freely, and that our alliance remains as strong as the iron of the currents that keep our heritage in due place." Laughter followed the cruel joke. The cups were erected in a collective gift. In the adjacent kitchen, Isaiah watched everything with impassive expression while overseeing the other slaves who prepared and served the food. In a distant corner, a special bottle of red wine, a very expensive Bordeaux reserved for the end of the night, contained the carefully mixed, impossible-to-detect datura powder, especially for palates already dull for hours of drink. Outside, in the shadows between the garden ornamental trees, Peter was waiting. He wore dark clothes, his face covered with the forged soot to camouflage himself at night. He watched the mansion's illuminated windows, the sounds of music and laughs, the silhouettes dancing behind the silk curtains. In his bag attached to his body, he carried the instruments of his own carnival, one that would end the party with a purifying fire spectacle. The night advanced, and with it the celebration became increasingly unbridled. The string quartet had been replaced by slave musicians playing more lively melodies. The dances became freer, the higher laughs, the cups were increasingly frequently replenished. In the kitchens, Isaiah received orders to open more bottles, serve more dishes, prepare more empezas. At midnight, as planned, Joseph Whitfield announced the high moment of the party, a private ritual of the guardians that would take place in the mansion library, away from the eyes of wives and daughters. The 10 men, already visibly drunk, went to the darker covered room, where bookshelves full of never-read books covered the walls from the floor to the ceiling. Isaiah, following the plan, entered the library, carrying a tray with the special Bordeaux bottle and 10 crystal cups. "The wine that the Lord reserved for the occasion, Master Whitfield," announced his head down. "Ah, excellent," exclaimed Whitfield, staggering slightly. "Gentlemen, this is a Bordeaux of 1815, the year of Waterloo. A wine to celebrate great wins." The cups were filled. A toast was proposed to the continuous prosperity of the guardians, and the wine was consumed in large sips. Isaiah withdrew silently, closing the library door behind him. Outside the mansion, Peter received the combined signal, a lamp positioned briefly in the kitchen window and then deleted. It was indicative that adulterated wine had been served. Now I needed to wait approximately an hour for the substance to have a complete effect. During this period, Peter moved as a shadow around the mansion, positioning his devices in strategic places near the main exits, under the carriages parked in the front courtyard. near the fuel barrels used to heat the house, near the alcoholic beverages at the property's backgrounds. Each device was armed with extreme caution, the adjusted waves for specific durations. Around 1 in the morning, another sign came from the house, 2 bright lamp blinks. Isaiah confirmed that men in the library were deeply dormant, some already fallen on sofas and armchairs, others with their heads supported on the large mahogany table. It was the moment. Peter entered the mansion through the back door, where Rachel was waiting for him. The young woman was pale, shivering slightly but determined. "The guests are all in the main hall or have already retired to the guest rooms," he whispered. "The children are sleeping on the 3rd floor with the babysitters." Peter nodded. His plan had been carefully elaborated to reach only 10 men in the library, not his wives, not his innocent children. "Go to Isaiah's cabin now," he instructed. "Take the other 2 kitchen girls with you. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." Rachel hesitated. "And you?" "I have a commitment to fulfill," he simply answered. His eyes, reflecting the flames of the lamps, seemed to contain the whole fire of hell. With silent steps, Peter went to the library. On the way, he left highly flammable oil tracks, creating ways that would eventually connect, forming a fire net that would converge into the room where the guardians rested in induced sleep. Upon reaching the library door, Peter stopped for a moment. He took a deep breath, letting his mother's memory of all witnessed atrocities of his own public humiliation crystallize in his mind as a final justification for what he was about to do. Pushed the door quietly. The 10 men were exactly as Isaiah had described, completely unconscious, vulnerable, defenseless. Joseph Whitfield, still using his king crown of carnival, was heavy in a leather armchair. Thomas Reynolds was spread to a sofa, the fallen inquisitor mask next door. William Barrett, the fake cardinal, had collapsed on the table. The Fontaine brothers slept next to each other in a Persian rug. James Hamilton, Samuel Montgomery, George Anderson, and Frederick Parker were distributed in various positions throughout the room. Charles Livingston, the young English, was the only one still sitting properly, his head hanging to the side, the Venetian mask still partially covering his face. Peter observed them for a moment, those men who considered themselves gods among mortals, now as vulnerable as children. In their carnival fantasies, they looked like actors of a grotesque piece whose last act was about to begin. With methodic movements, the blacksmith closed all the windows of the library and locked the door inside. Then he removed from his bag the last incendiary devices, positioning them strategically around the room under bookshelves, near the heavy curtains, along with maps and documents spread over the central table. When everything was prepared, Peter positioned himself in the center of the room. From his bag, he removed a small bottle containing an amber liquid, a special mixture that had prepared in the forge, flaxseed, terebintina, and vegetable resins. It poured the content in a circle around the unconscious men. "This is Ogum's judgment," pronounced in a voice baisha, more to yourself than for the dormant. "The fire purifies. The fire transforms. The fire liberates." With a supernatural calm, Peter lit a match and brought him closer to the trail of oil. The flame came to life instantly, running through the circle with scary speed. At the same time, it lit the wicks of the devices scattered throughout the room and, using a small makeshift torch, burned down the oil traces it had left through the corridors. When the first flames began to lick the bookshelves and curtains, Peter headed at the back door of the library, a secondary exit that gave to a small inner garden. The moment he was about to leave, he heard a moan. Charles Livingston, the young English, was beginning to awaken, perhaps because he consumed less wine than others. His eyes, still turned around the drug, settled on Peter for a moment. "Fire," murmured confusingly, the pasty voice. "There is fire." "Yes," confirmed Peter, his face illuminated by the growing glow of the flames. "This is the fire my mother saw before she dies, the fire that cleans this place." By the time Peter left the library, the flames had already reached the ceiling. The intense heat would cause the incendiary devices to explode in calculated sequence, spreading the fire to other parts of the mansion. Oil traces through the corridors would ensure that the fire would spread rapidly, blocking escape routes. The blacksmith moved silently from the back of the property, moving away from the mansion as the fire began his relentless work. Behind him, the first scream cut the night. Someone had finally awakened to the flame nightmare. Arriving at a small elevation that offered a view to the entire plantation, Peter stopped. He turned to contemplate his work, his arms crossed over his chest, his face illuminated by the orange shine that now dominated the Whitfield mansion. Fire grew with impressive fury, fed by carefully positioned materials, consuming the structure that had been a symbol of oppression and cruelty for so long. Desperate screams echoed at night, while party costumes ran disoriented by the gardens, many still wearing their carnival masks, a macabre dance illuminated by the flames. From the library, however, no human sound emerged, only the hungry roar of fire consuming everything in its way. In the small plantation chapel, far from the big house, Solomon was waiting with 6 sealed horses, the fastest of the stables. Beside his side were Isaiah, Rachel, Esther, Jacob, and 20 slaves who had been secretly informed to be ready that night. When Peter arrived, the group received him in silence. Words were unnecessary. The orange shine in the night sky said everything that needed to be said. "Now," said Peter simply. As a carefully rehearsed ceremony, the group was organized quickly. The elderly and the children were positioned in the horses, each animal taking 2 or 3 people. The others would go on foot, at least initially. The escape route had been meticulously planned. It would avoid main roads, followed by swamps and dense forests, where hunting dogs would have difficulty tracking, enjoying the confusion of Mardi Gras when they eventually crossed with settlements. Before leaving, Peter performed one last ritual. From his bag, he removed a small blacksmith hammer, who had forged especially for the occasion. With precise blows, it broke the chains and symbolic shackles they had brought. Tools of oppression turned into relics of a past that left behind. The metal fragments were arranged in a circle, and in the center Peter lit a small fire. The flames consumed a piece of fabric that had belonged to his mother, his latest material bond with Hannah. "The fire purifies," said aloud, addressing the group. "Fire transforms. Fire liberates. Those who get, tell our history. Those who leave, carry our truth." While the group began its journey north, moving away from Plantation on Fire, a column of black smoke rose to the starry sky, a dark pillar marking the flaming tomb of the Guardians, and the birth of a legend that would echo for generations. The next morning, the news of the fire in the Whitfield plantation spread like wildfire throughout the Baton Rouge and neighboring regions. Initial reports spoke of accident, a candle left on during Mardi Gras festivities, combined with excessive amounts of alcohol and flammable decorations. But when the charred bodies of the 10 men were discovered in the library locked inside, the accident theory was rapidly replaced by darker suspicions. The sheriff of the parish of East Baton Rouge, second-degree cousin of Joseph Whitfield, conducted an inadvertently stipulated and soon stated that it was a premeditated act of slave insurrection, the official term used to avoid the word revenge, which would imply justification. Alarmed letters began to circulate among slave owners throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. "Blacks have learned to use fire as a weapon," wrote a New Orleans planner to the governor. "The method is sophisticated and calculated to maximize destruction and minimize chances of escape from victims." In a plantation near Natchez, Mississippi, 3 weeks after the Whitfield fire, the main house was consumed by flames at night. The owner and his 2 adult sons, known for the exceptional cruelty to his slaves, did not survive. Local authorities found evidence of incendiary devices similar to those used in Baton Rouge. A month later, in Mobile, Alabama, the mansion of a judge who routinely denied even the minimum rights guaranteed by law to slaves was reduced to ashes. Again, the investigations pointed to a meticulously planned fire, with escape routes blocked by strategically positioned flames. Throughout the region, a new term began to circulate in terrified whispers between the proprietary class: Peter's method, or simply judgment. Among slaves, however, the term was pronounced with reverence, not as a threat, but as a promise, as hope. The regional authorities responded with expanded brutality. Patrols were intensified, punishments became even more severe, restrictions on movements and slave meetings were hardened. The simple act of a slave being found with matches or any flammable material has become a crime that can immediately. The Louisiana legislature has hastily approved a status specifically forbidding slaves from working as blacksmith without constant supervision of a white man, an implicit recognition of danger represented by someone who, as Peter, dominated the secrets of fire and metal. In plantations across the South, forces were removed from the main structures, usually isolated by pits or bread cards that would function as fire barriers. The fear of fire, and Peter's example, had permanently established in the heart of the slave system. Meanwhile, the group led by Peter followed his carefully planned route to the north. It was not a makeshift escape, but a strategic withdrawal, with previously identified rest points, contacts established with free blacks and white abolitionists, alternative routes in case of persecution. But the notoriety of Peter's method made it inevitable that a large-scale hunt was organized. It was not just about recapturing fugitive slaves. It was an example to demonstrate that no challenge to the system could remain unpunished. 6 weeks after the fire, when the group had already crossed the Tennessee border, the first hunting dogs were heard in the distance. The Louisiana State Militia, reinforced by Mississippi professional slave hunters, had finally found its trail. Peter gathered the group in the dense forest where they had camped. "You must continue," he said calmly. "They are divided into smaller groups as we planned. Follow the different routes. We will meet at the combined point in Ohio." Isaiah, who had become her right arm during the journey, protested. "We can't separate now. Together we are stronger." Peter shook his head. "Together we are a larger target. Separated, some will surely be able to reach the north." His golden eyes traveled the faces around, men, women, and children who had trusted him, who had risked everything for the promise of freedom. "And I'll make sure you have enough time." The meaning of your words was clear to everyone. Peter intended to be left behind, create a distraction, perhaps even let themselves capture so that others could escape. A murmur of protests was elevated between the group. "Don't argue," Peter cut firmly. "This is my choice, my fire, my responsibility." Solomon the old horses took a step ahead. "You will not be alone. These old bones would not take much more of the journey anyway." Isaiah also positioned himself next to Peter. "3 will cause more confusion than 1. After short farewells, there was no time for long separations. The main group was divided into 4 smaller units, each heading in a different direction. Peter, Solomon, and Isaiah remained, preparing for their last resistance. During the following hours, the 3 men worked methodically, applying simplified versions of the method to a large area of the forest. Incendiary traps were positioned in places geckos, false trails created to confuse persecutors, small controlled fire spots started to generate smoke curtains. When the sun began to set, the sounds of persecution were significantly closer. Dog barking, men's voices, occasional rifle shots. The hunt had turned into a siege. "They will arrive within an hour," calculated Solomon, his old eyes still impressively agile when assessing the distance from the sounds. Peter nodded. "So it's time to light our last fire." The 3 men occupied different positions in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. Each carried a simplified version of the incendiary devices that had destroyed the Whitfield mansion. The plan was simple: to create enough confusion to divide the persecutors, forcing them to spread across the forest instead of following as a concentrated group behind the fugitives. "It was an honor to forge this path with you," said Peter, squeezing each mate's shoulder. There was no fear on his face, only the same calm resolution that had guided him from his mother's death. The first line of slave hunters emerged between trees precisely when the last ray of sun disappeared on the horizon. There were 6 men, led by a burly foreman that Peter recognized immediately: Conrad Steiner, the man who had raped his mother, the first to whip him on the day of his public humiliation. Somehow it seemed appropriate for the circle to close like this. "There he is!" shouted Steiner, pointing to Peter that he remained calmly in the center of the clearing. "It's the incendiary blacksmith." The hunters advanced confidently, rifles pointed, smiles of triumph in their faces. Peter remained motionless, as if he resignedly waited for his capture. When they were just 20 steps away, the blacksmith slowly lifted his right hand, not in surrender gesture, but command. "Now," he said simply. In response, 3 lines of fire appeared simultaneously at different points around the clearing. The flames ran at scary speed through invisible gunpowder tracks and carefully prepared flammable oils, forming a complete circle that surrounded the hunters and their prey in a fire arena. The confusion was instantaneous. Hunting dogs howled panic, some running wildly into the flames. The men shouted contradictory orders, trying to reorganize as the fire grew around them. Taking advantage of chaos, Isaiah and Solomon activated the second phase of the plane, small explosions at distant points of the forest, creating the illusion that a much larger group was spread across the area. The sounds completely disoriented the persecutors, who began to shoot their random towards their branches. In the center of the clearing, now illuminated by the surrounding fire, Peter and Conrad Steiner were stared at each other. The foreman had lost his rifle in the initial confusion, but pulled out a bolty pistol, pointing it straight to the blacksmith's chest. "You won't escape this time, Black," growled Steiner, the face containing face of hatred. "I'll take your head back to Baton Rouge." Peter smiled serenely. "My head is worth nothing, Steiner. It's what is inside her that haunts her dreams. The knowledge I went through, the method I taught to others." A shot echoed in the clearing. Peter felt the impact of the bullet on his left shoulder, but remained standing, unshakable. The wound seemed distant, as if he had hit another person. "You can kill me," it continued calmly, taking a step toward the astonished foreman. "But it can't kill what I started. The fire spreads, Steiner, from one forge to another, from one plantation to another. Each time a big house burns, it will be my name that will whisper in the senzalas." Steiner shot again, the bullet reaching Peter in the chest. The blacksmith staggered but did not fall. Around them, the circle of fire had closed even more, isolating them from the rest of the chaos. The heat was intense, waving the air between them. "Die soon!" shouted Steiner in despair, firing his last bullet. Peter finally fell to his knees, 3 wounds bleeding profusely. But even so, he kept his eyes fixed on the foreman, a serene smile on his face. "The fire purifies," he murmured. "The fire transforms,